Relax and listen to the voice. This is it, everyone. The final stories in the Grimm's Fairy Tales collection. Thank you all for helping to make this such a successful series. We hope you enjoy these last few tales. And if you do enjoy them, please remember to like, subscribe, and share this channel with your friends and family. The Carpenter and the Turner. A carpenter and a turner wanted to see who could make the best piece of work. The carpenter made a dish that could swim by itself, while the turner made wings that he could use to fly. Everyone said that the carpenter's masterpiece was better, so the turner took his wings, put them on, and flew out of the country. He flew the entire day until he came to another country, where a prince saw him flying and asked to borrow the pair of wings. Since the prince promised to pay him well, the turner gave him the wings, and the prince flew to another kingdom. There he saw a tower illuminated by many lights. He decided to swoop down to the ground and find out what the occasion was. When he learned that the most beautiful princess in the world lived there, he became very curious. In the evening, he flew through an open window and was able to be with the princess, but not for very long, for they were betrayed, and the prince and princess were sentenced to die at the stake. However, the prince had taken his wings with him, and as the flames flared, he tied the wings on and flew with the princess to his homeland, where he descended to the ground. Since everyone had been sad during his absence, he revealed his true identity, and he was elected king. After some time had passed, the father of the maiden who had been carried away by the prince made it known that whoever brought back his daughter would receive half of his kingdom. When the prince learned about this, he gathered together an army and brought the princess to her father, who was then forced to keep his promise. The Crows. An honest and diligent soldier had earned and saved some money because he had been diligent and had not squandered his earnings in the taverns as the other soldiers had. It so happened that two of his comrades were quite devious and wanted to get at his money, so they pretended to be very friendly with him. One day they said to him, "Listen, why should we stay here in this city? We're locked in as though we are prisoners. Besides, someone such as you could really earn something decent and live happily if you were in your own country." They kept talking to him like this until he finally agreed to leave with them. However, the other two only intended to steal his money. After they had gone part of the way, the two soldiers said, "We must turn right over there if we want to get to the border." "No," he replied. "That leads straight back to the city. We've got to keep to our left." "What?" the other two exclaimed. "You always want to have the last word in everything." Then they rushed at him and began hitting him until he fell down, and they took the money out of his pocket, but that wasn't enough. They poked his eyes out, dragged him to the gallows, and tied him up tightly. After that, they left him behind and went back to the city with the stolen money. The poor blind man wasn't aware that he had been left in such a terrible place. He groped about and could feel that he was sitting beneath a beam of wood. Since he thought it was a cross, he said, "Well, at least it was good of them to tie me up under the cross. At least God is with me." And he began praying to God. When it was almost night, he heard the fluttering of wings, which turned out to be 3 crows landing on the beam. After that, he heard one of them say, "Sister, what good news have you brought?" Then the second crow said,
Oh, if only the people knew what we know. The king's daughter is sick, and the old king has promised to give her to anyone who can cure her. But no one can do it, for she'll only get well again if the toad in the pond over there is burned to ashes, and she drinks the ashes with some water. Ah, if only the people knew what we know. A dew will fall from heaven tonight, and it will have such miraculous healing powers that the blind will be able to regain their sight if they rub their eyes with it.
Oh, if only the people knew what we know. The toad can only help one person, and the dew can only help a few. Meanwhile, there's a great emergency in the city. All the wells are dried out, and nobody knows if the people removed the square stone in the marketplace and dug beneath that spot, the most beautiful water would gush forth. After the three crows had finished talking, the blind man heard the fluttering of wings again, and they flew away. Gradually he was able to untie himself, and then he stooped down, pulled out a few blades of grass, and rubbed his eyes with the dew that had fallen on them. All at once he regained his sight. The moon and the stars were in the sky, and he saw that he was standing next to the gallows. After that, he looked for some earthenware to gather as much of the precious dew as he could find. When this was done, he went to the pond, dug into the water, grabbed hold of the toad, and burned it to ashes. Next, he carried the ashes to the king's court and had the king's daughter take some. When she was restored to health, he demanded her for his wife, as the king had promised. However, the king didn't take a liking to him because he was dressed so poorly, and he said that whoever wanted to have his daughter would first have to provide water for the city. In this way the king hoped to get rid of him. But the soldier went to the city and ordered the people to remove the square stone from the marketplace and to dig beneath the spot for water. No sooner had they dug than they hit upon a spring, and a mighty jet of water shot forth. Now the king could no longer refuse to give his daughter to him. After the wedding, they lived together in a happy marriage. One day when the soldier was taking a walk through the fields, he met his former comrades who had treated him so disgracefully. They didn't recognize him, but he knew them right away and went up to them.
"Look," he said, "I'm your former comrade whose eyes you poked out so cruelly, but fortunately the dear Lord has allowed me to prosper."
The men then fell to his feet and begged for mercy. Since he had a kind heart, he took pity on them and brought them back to his palace. He gave them food and clothes afterwards and told them what happened and how he had gained such honor. When the two men heard all that, they were restless and eager to spend the night beneath the gallows to see if they could perhaps hear something good as well. So they went and sat under the gallows. Soon they heard the fluttering of wings above their heads, and three crows arrived. One of them said to the others, "Listen, sisters, someone must have overheard us, for the king's daughter is healthy, the toad is gone from the pond, a blind man has regained his sight, and they've dug a fresh well in the city. Come on, let's look for the eavesdropper and punish him." When they swooped down from the beam, they found the two soldiers, and before the men could defend themselves, the crows sat on their heads and hacked out their eyes, and they kept hacking their faces until they were dead, and they left them lying beneath the gallows. After a few days, when the soldiers had not returned, their former comrade thought, "Where could the two be wandering about?" He went out to look for them, but found nothing except their bones, which he took away from the gallows and buried in a grave. The Smith and the Devil. Once upon a time there was a blacksmith who enjoyed life. He squandered his money and carried on many lawsuits. After a few years he didn't have a single cent left in his pouch. "Why should I torture myself any longer in this world?" he thought. So he went into the forest with the intention of hanging himself from a tree. Just as he was about to stick his head into the noose, a man with a long white beard came out from behind a tree, carrying a large book in his hand.
"Listen, blacksmith," he said. "Write your name down in this large book, and for 10 long years you will have a good life. But after that, you'll be mine, and I will come and fetch you."
"Who are you?" asked the blacksmith.
"I'm the devil."
"What can you do?"
"I can make myself as tall as a fir tree and as small as a mouse."
Then show me. Seeing is believing," said the blacksmith. Thereupon the devil made himself as tall as a fir tree and as small as a mouse. "Oh, that's good," said the blacksmith. "Give me the book, and I'll write down my name." After the blacksmith had signed his name, the devil said,
"Now just go home, and you'll find chests and boxes filled to the brim. And since you've not made much of a fuss, I'll also visit you once during this time."
The blacksmith went home, where he found all of his pockets, boxes, and chests filled with gold coins, and no matter how much he took, they never became empty or even reduced in the least. So he began his merry life once again, invited his comrades to join him, and was the happiest fellow in the world. After a few years had passed, the devil stopped by one day, as he had promised, to see how things were going. On his departure, he gave the blacksmith a leather sack and told him that whoever jumped into the sack would not be able to get out again until the blacksmith himself took him out. Indeed, the blacksmith had a great deal of fun with it. When the 10 years were over, however, the devil returned to him.
"Your time is up, and now you are mine. Get ready for your trip."
"All right," said the blacksmith, who swung his leather sack over his back and went away with the devil. When they came to the place in the forest where the blacksmith had wanted to hang himself, he said to the devil, "I want to make sure that you really are the devil. Make yourself as large as a fir tree and as small as a mouse again." The devil was prepared and performed his feat, but just as he changed himself into a mouse, the blacksmith grabbed him and stuck him into the sack. Then the blacksmith cut off a stick from a nearby tree, threw the sack to the ground, and began beating the devil, who screamed pitifully and ran back and forth in the sack. Yet it was all in vain. He couldn't get out. Finally, the blacksmith said, "I'll let you go if you give me the sheet from your large book on which I wrote my name." The devil refused at first, but eventually he gave in. The sheet was ripped out of the book, and the devil returned home to hell, annoyed that he had let himself be duped and beaten as well. Meanwhile, the blacksmith went home to his smithy and continued to live happily as long as it was God's will. Finally, he became sick, and when he realized death was near, he ordered 2 long nails and a hammer to be put into his coffin. This was done just as he had instructed, and after he died, he approached the heaven's gate and knocked. However, St. Peter refused to open the gate because the blacksmith had lived in a league with the devil. When the blacksmith heard this, he turned around and went to hell, but the devil wouldn't let him enter either, for he had no desire to have the blacksmith in hell, where he would only make a spectacle of himself. Now the blacksmith was angry and began to make a lot of noise in front of Hell's gate. A little demon became curious and wanted to see what the blacksmith was doing, so he opened the gate a little and looked out. Very quickly the blacksmith grabbed him by the nose and nailed him solidly to the gate of hell with one of the nails he had brought with him. The little demon began to screech like a wildcat, so that another demon was drawn to the gate. He too stuck his head out, and the blacksmith was alert. He grabbed this one by the ear and nailed him to the gate next to the first little demon. Now both of them began to let out such terrible cries that the old devil himself came running. When he saw the two little demons nailed solidly to the gate, he became so terribly angry that he wept and jumped about. Then he ran up to heaven to see the dear Lord. Once there, he told the Lord that he had to admit the blacksmith into heaven. There was nothing anyone could do to stop the blacksmith, the devil said. So the blacksmith would continue to nail all the demons by their noses and ears, and he, the devil, would no longer be master in hell. Well, the dear Lord and St. Peter quickly realized that if they wanted to get rid of the devil, then they would have to let the blacksmith enter heaven. So now, the blacksmith sits in heaven, nicely and peacefully, but I don't know how the two little demons were able to free themselves. The Three Sisters. Once upon a time there was a rich king who was so rich that he believed his wealth would last forever. Therefore, he wallowed in luxury and gambled on a golden board with silver dice. All of this continued for some time until he squandered his wealth and was forced to mortgage his cities and castles one after the other. Finally, nothing was left except an old castle in the forest. He moved there with his queen and 3 daughters, and their lives were miserable. They had only potatoes to eat for their daily meal. One day the king decided to go hunting to see if he could perhaps shoot a hare. After filling his pockets full of potatoes, he went off to a nearby forest that nobody dared enter because terrible stories had been told about what one might encounter there, such as bears that ate people, eagles that hacked out eyes, and wolves, lions, and all kinds of cruel beasts. However, the king was not in the least afraid and went straight into the forest. At first he didn't see anything except for huge and mighty trees, and everything was quiet beneath them. After he had walked around for a while, he became hungry and sat down underneath a tree to eat his potatoes. All of a sudden, a bear came out of the thicket, trotted straight towards him and growled, "How dare you sit under my honey tree? You will pay for this." The king was horrified and handed the bear's potatoes to appease him, but the bear began to speak and said, "I don't want your potatoes. I'm going to eat you yourself. But if you give me your oldest daughter, you can save yourself. If you do this, I'll give you 100 pounds of gold in the bargain." Since the king was afraid of being eaten, he said, "You shall have her. Just let me go in peace." The bear showed him the way out of the forest and growled after him, "In 1 week's time, I'll come and fetch my bride." As he went home, the king felt more at ease and was convinced that the bear would not be able to crawl through a keyhole. So from then on, everything at the castle was to be shut tight. He ordered all the gates to be locked, the drawbridges to be lifted, and told his daughter not to worry. But just to be on the safe side, and to protect his daughter from the bear bridegroom, he gave her a little room under the pinnacle, high up in the castle. She was to hide there until the week was over. Early on the 7th morning, however, when everyone was still asleep, a splendid coach drawn by 6 horses came driving up to the castle. It was surrounded by numerous knights clad in gold, and as soon as the coach was up in front, the drawbridges dropped down by themselves, and the locks sprung open without a key. The coach drove into the courtyard, and a young, handsome prince stepped out of it. When the king was wakened by the noise and looked out the window, he saw the prince had already fetched his oldest daughter from the locked room and was lifting her into the coach. He could just call after her.
"Farewell, my maiden dear. I see you're off to wed the bear."
She waved to him with her little white handkerchief from the coach, and then they sped off into the magic forest, as if the coach were harnessed to the wind. The king felt very bad about having given his daughter to a bear. He was so sad that he and the queen wept for 3 days. But on the 4th day, after he had done enough weeping, he realized that he couldn't change what had happened, and he went down into the courtyard. There he found a chest made out of smooth wood, which was very difficult to lift. Immediately he remembered what the bear had promised him, so he opened the chest and found hundreds of pounds of glittering and glistening gold. When the king saw the gold, he felt consoled. He reacquired his cities and kingdom and began leading his former life of luxury once more. Soon after, he was obliged to mortgage everything all over again, and he retreated to his castle in the forest and had nothing to eat but potatoes. Yet the king still had a falcon, and one day the king took it hunting with him and went out into the field to get something better to eat. The falcon soared high into the sky and flew in the direction of the dark magic forest, which the king no longer dared to enter. Right after the falcon flew into the woods, an eagle shot out and pursued the falcon, which returned to the king, who tried to fend off the eagle with his spear, but the eagle grabbed the spear and broke it, as if it were a reed. Then the eagle crushed the falcon with one claw and dug into the king's shoulder with the other.
"Why have you disturbed my kingdom in the sky?"
the eagle cried out.
"Either you give me your second daughter for my wife, or you shall die."
"All right,"
the king said.
"You shall have my second daughter, but what will you give me for her?"
200 pounds of gold,
the eagle said.
"In 7 weeks I'll come to fetch her."
Then the eagle let him go and flew off into the forest. The king felt bad about having also sold his second daughter to a wild beast, and he didn't dare tell her anything about it. 6 weeks passed, and in the 7th the princess went out one day on the lawn in front of the castle to water the linseed. All at once a splendid parade of handsome knights came riding up, and at their head was the handsomest knight of all, who dismounted and cried out,
"Up you go, my maiden dear. Come wed the eagle. No need to fear."
And before she could answer him, he had already lifted her onto his horse and raced off with her into the forest, flying like a bird.
"Farewell, farewell,"
shouted the knight. The king and queen waited a long time for the princess to come back to the castle, but no matter how long they waited, she didn't return. Then the king finally revealed that he had promised her to an eagle when he had once been in trouble, and the eagle must have come and fetched her. After the king got over his sadness somewhat, he remembered the eagle's promise. He went down to the lawn and found 2 golden eggs, each weighing 100 pounds.
"Money is a sign of piety,"
thought the king, and he dismissed all gloomy thoughts from his mind. He resumed his merrymaking once more and lived luxuriously until he ran through the 200 pounds of gold. Then the king returned to the castle in the forest yet again, and the last of the princesses had to boil the potatoes. The king didn't want to hunt any more hares in the forest or any more birds in the sky, but he did desire to eat some fish. So the princesses had to weave a net, which he took with him to the pond not far from the castle. A small boat was there, and he got in and threw the net into the water. On his very first try, he caught a bunch of beautiful flounders with red speckles, but when he wanted to row ashore with his catch, the boat wouldn't budge, and he couldn't get it to move no matter how much he tried. All of a sudden, an enormous whale came puffing up to him and cried out,
Who said you could catch the subjects of my realm and take them away with you? This will cost you your life."
As the whale said this, he opened his jaws as if he were going to swallow the king and the little boat as well. When the king saw his terrible jaws, he completely lost his courage and recalled that he had a third daughter.
"Spare my life," he cried out, "and you shall have my third daughter." "That's fine with me,"
roared the whale.
"I'll also give you something for her. I don't have gold. That's not good enough for me. But the floor of my sea is plastered with precious pearls. I'll give you 3 sacks of them. In the 7th month, I'll come and fetch my bride."
Then the whale dived down into the water, while the king rowed ashore and brought the flounders home. Yet when they were baked, he refused to eat any of them, and when he looked at his daughter, the only one left, and the most beautiful and loveliest of them all, he felt as if 1,000 knives were cutting his heart. 6 months passed, and the queen and princess didn't know what was wrong with the king, for he didn't smile once during all of that time. In the 7th month, the princess was in the courtyard in front of a man-made well and drew a glass of water. Suddenly a coach with 6 white horses and men clad entirely in silver came driving up. A prince stepped out of the coach, and he was more handsome than any other prince she had seen in her entire life. He asked her for a glass of water, and when she handed it to him, he embraced her and lifted her into the coach. And then they drove back through the gate, over the field, and toward the pond.
"Farewell, maiden dear. You're bound to wed the whale down there," said the king.
The queen stood at the window and watched the coach as it moved off in the distance. When she was unable to find her daughter, her heart was saddened, and she called for her and looked for her everywhere, but the daughter was nowhere to be seen or heard. When the queen was certain that the princess could not be found, she began to weep, and now the king revealed to her that a whale must have fetched their daughter, for he had been forced to promise their daughter to him. Indeed, that was the reason he had been so sad. The king wanted to comfort his wife and told her about the great treasure they would now get for the princess. However, the queen didn't want to hear anything about it and said that her only child was more dear to her than all the treasures of the world. During the time that the whale prince had carried off the princess, his servants had carried 3 tremendous sacks into the castle, which the king found at the door. When he opened them, he found they were full of big, beautiful, and precious pearls, just as large as the fattest peas imaginable. All of a sudden, he was rich again, and richer than he had ever been before. He reacquired his cities and castles, but this time, he didn't resume his luxurious way of living. Instead, he became quiet and thrifty. Whenever he thought about what had happened to his 3 dear daughters with the wild beasts, and that perhaps they had already been eaten up, he lost all his zest for life. Meanwhile, the queen couldn't be consoled and wept more tears for her daughters than all the pearls the whale had given them. Finally, she became more calm and peaceful, and after some time she was able to become happy again, for she gave birth to a handsome baby boy. Since God had given them the child so unexpectedly, he was named Reinald the Miracle Child. The boy grew big and strong, and the queen often told him about his 3 sisters, who were being held prisoners by the 3 beasts in the magic forest. When Reinald turned 16, he demanded some armor and a sword from the king, and when he received all of this, he decided to embark on an adventure. So he said a blessing to his parents and set forth. He went straight towards the magic forest and had only one thing on his mind, to search for his sisters. At first, he wandered around in the great forest for a long time without encountering a human being or a beast. But after 3 days, he saw a young woman sitting in front of a cave and playing with a young bear cub, while another very young one was lying in her lap. Reinhold thought she must surely be his oldest sister, so he left his horse behind him and he approached her.
"Dearest sister," he said, "I'm your brother Reinhold, and I've come to visit you."
The princess looked at him, and since he resembled her father very strongly, she didn't doubt his words, but she was frightened and said,
"Oh, dearest brother, hurry and run away as fast as you can if you value your life. When my husband the bear comes home and finds you here, he'll show you no mercy and he will eat you up."
But Reinhold said,
"I'm not afraid, and I won't leave you until I know how you are and what things are like for you."
When the princess saw that he was resolute, she led him back into the dark cave that was like the dwelling of a bear. On one side was a heap of leaves and hay on which the old bear and his cub slept, and on the other side was a magnificent bed with red covers trimmed with gold. That belonged to the princess. She told him to crawl under the bed and handed him something to eat. It didn't take long before the bear came home.
I smell the flesh of a human being,"
he said, and he wanted to stick his hands under the bed. But the princess cried out,
"Be quiet! Who would ever come here?"
"I found a horse in the forest and I ate it,"
he growled, and his nose was still bloody from eating the horse.
"Where there's a horse, there's a man, and I smell that man."
Again, he wanted to look under the bed, but she gave him such a kick in his side that he did a somersault, went back to his place, put his paw in his mouth, and fell asleep. Every 7th day the bear was restored to his natural form. He became a handsome prince, his cave a splendid castle, the animals in the forest his servants. It was on such a day that he had fetched the princess. Beautiful young women had come to meet her from the castle. There had been a glorious festival, and she had gone to sleep full of joy, but when she had awakened, she had found herself lying in the bear's dark cave, and her husband had been turned into a bear growling at her feet. Only the bed and everything she had touched had remained in its natural condition and hadn't been changed. Thus she lived 6 days in suffering, but on the 7th she was comforted. She didn't grow old because only 1 day a week counted in her life, and she was content with her existence. She had given her husband 2 sons, who also became bears for 6 days and regained their human form on the 7th day. She stuffed their straw bed with the most delicious food all the time, including cake and fruit, and they lived off this food the entire week. Moreover, the bear obeyed her and did whatever she wanted. When Reinhold awoke, he lay in a silken bed. Servants waited on him and dressed him in the finest clothes, for his visit fell right on the 7th day. His sister entered with the 2 handsome princes and his brother-in-law the bear. They were glad about his arrival. Everything was magnificent and glorious, and the entire day was filled with pleasurable and joyous things. But in the evening the princess said,
"Dear brother, now it's time for you to depart. At daybreak, my husband will become a bear again, and if he finds you here tomorrow, he won't be able to control his natural instincts, and he will eat you up."
Then the bear prince came and gave him 3 bear hairs and said, "Whenever you're in trouble, just rub these hairs, and I'll come to your aid." Then they kissed each other and said farewell. Reinald climbed into a carriage drawn by 6 horses and was driven off. He went over hill and valley, up and down mountains, through deserts and forests, shrubs and hedges, without stopping to rest, until the sky began turning gray at dusk. Then Reinald suddenly lay on the ground, and the horses and carriage disappeared. At sunrise, he saw 6 ants galloping away, drawing a nutshell behind them. Reinald realized he was still in the magic forest, and wanted to search for his second sister. Again, he wandered about aimlessly and lonely for 3 days without accomplishing anything, but on the 4th day, he heard a big eagle come swooping down to settle in a nest. Reinald hid in the bushes and waited for the eagle to fly away. After 7 hours, it soared into the air again. Then Reinald emerged from the bushes, went over to the tree, and cried out, "Dearest sister, are you up above? If so, let me hear your voice. I'm Reinald, your brother, and I've come to visit you." Then he heard a voice calling down to him,
"If you're Reinald, my dearest brother, whom I've never seen, come up to me."
Reinald wanted to climb the tree, but the trunk was too thick and slippery. He tried 3 times in vain. Suddenly, a silken rope ladder dropped down, and he climbed it until he reached the eagle's nest, which was strong and secure like a platform on a linden tree. His sister sat under a canopy made out of rose-colored silk, and an eagle's egg was lying on her lap. She was keeping it warm in order to hatch it. They kissed each other and rejoiced, but after a while the princess said,
"Now hurry and see to it that you get out of here, dearest brother. If the eagle, my husband, sees you, he'll hack your eyes out and devour your heart, as he's already done with 3 of your servants who were looking for you in the forest."
"No," said Reinald. "I'm staying here until your husband is transformed."
"Well, that will happen, but only in 6 weeks. If you can hold out that long, go and hide in the tree. It's hollow on the inside, and I'll drop food down to you every day."
Reinald crawled into the tree, and the princess let food down to him every day, just as she had said. Whenever the eagle flew away, he climbed up to her. After 6 weeks, the eagle was transformed, and once more Reinald awoke in a bed that was like the one at his brother-in-law the bear's place. Only here it was even more splendid, and he lived with the eagle prince in great joy. On the 7th evening they said their farewells. The eagle gave him 3 eagle feathers and said,
"If you're ever in trouble, rub them, and I'll come to your aid."
Then he gave him servants to show him the way out of the forest. But when morning came, they suddenly disappeared, and Reinald was all alone on top of a high rocky cliff in a terrible wilderness. He looked around him, and in the distance he saw the reflection of a large lake, which glistened from the sun's rays. He thought of his 3rd sister, who might be there, so he began to climb down the cliff and work his way through the bushes and between the rocks. He needed 3 days to do all of this, and he often lost sight of the lake, but on the 4th day he succeeded in getting there. Once he was on the bank, he called out, "Dearest sister, if you're in the water, let me hear your voice. I'm Reinald, your brother, and I've come to visit you." But no one answered, and everything was very quiet. He threw breadcrumbs into the water and said to the fish, "Hey, dear fish, go to my sister and tell her that Reinald, the Wonder Child, is here, and that he wants to see her." But the red-speckled flounder snapped up the bread and didn't listen to his words. Then he saw a little boat and immediately took off his armor. He kept only a sword in his hand as he jumped into the boat and rowed off. After he had gone a long way, he saw a chimney made of rock crystal jutting out of the water, and there was a pleasant smell rising up from it. Reinald rowed the boat toward it and was convinced that his sister was living down below, so he climbed on top of the chimney and slid down. The princess was greatly startled when she suddenly saw a pair of wriggling legs followed shortly by a whole man who identified himself as her brother. She rejoiced with all of her heart, but then she turned sad and said,
"The whale has heard that you've wanted to come visit me, and he's declared that if you come while he's a whale, he will not be able to control his desires to eat you up. Moreover, he'll break my crystal house, and I'll also perish in the flood of water."
"Can't you just hide me until the time comes when the magic loses its power?"
"Oh no, how can I do that? Don't you see that the walls are all made of crystal, and you can see right through them?"
Nevertheless, she thought, and finally she remembered the room where the wood was kept. She arranged the wood in such a careful way that nobody could see anything from the outside, and it was there that she hid the Wonder Child. Soon after, the whale came, and the princess trembled like an aspen leaf. He swam around the crystal house a few times, and when he saw a little piece of Reinald's clothing sticking out of the wood, he beat his tail, snorted ferociously, and if he had seen more, he surely would have destroyed the house. He came once a day and swam around it until the magic stopped in the 7th month. Suddenly, Reinald found himself in a castle right in the middle of an island, and the castle surpassed even the splendor of the eagle's castle. Now he lived with his sister and brother-in-law for a whole month in the lap of luxury. When the time was over, the whale gave him 3 scales and said, "When you're in trouble, rub them, and I'll come to your aid." The whale brought him to the bank, where his armor was still lying on the ground. The Wonder Child moved around in the wilderness for 7 more days, and he slept 7 nights under the open skies. Then he caught sight of a castle with a steel gate that had a mighty lock on it. In front of the gate was a black bull with flashing eyes. It was guarding the entrance, and Reinald attacked it. He gave the bull a powerful blow on its neck, but the neck was made of pure steel, and the sword broke as if it were made of glass. He tried to use his lance, but it broke like a piece of straw. Then the bull grabbed him with its horns and threw him into the air so that he got caught in the branches of a tree. In his desperation, Reinald remembered the 3 bear's hairs and rubbed them in his hand. All at once the bear appeared and fought with the bull. He tore the bull to pieces, but a bird came out of the bull's stomach, flew high into the air, and rushed off. But Reinald rubbed the 3 eagle's feathers, and suddenly a mighty eagle came flying through the air and pursued the bird, which flew directly toward a pond. The eagle dived at the bird and mangled it, but Reinald saw the bird drop a golden egg into the water. Now he rubbed the 3 fish scales in his hand, and immediately a whale came swimming up, swallowed the egg, and spat it out onto the shore. Reinald picked it up and cracked it open with a stone. Inside he found a little key that fit the steel gate. As soon as he touched the gate with the key, the gate sprang open by itself, and he entered. All the bars on the other doors slid off by themselves, and he went through 7 doors into 7 splendid and brightly lit rooms. In the last room, a maiden was lying asleep on a bed. She was so beautiful that he was completely dazzled by her. He sought to wake her up, but it was in vain. Her sleep was so deep that she seemed to be dead. In his rage, he struck a black slate standing next to the bed, and at that very moment the maiden awoke, but fell right back to sleep. Reinald took the slate, and he threw it onto the stone floor so that it shattered into 1,000 pieces. No sooner did this happen than the maiden opened her eyes wide, and the magic spell was broken. She turned out to be the sister of Reinald's 3 brothers-in-law. Because she had rejected the love of a godless sorcerer, he had sentenced her to a death-like sleep and changed her brothers into animals. They were to remain that way so long as the black slate remained untouched. Reinald led the maiden out of the castle, and as they passed through the gate, his brothers-in-law came riding up from 3 different directions. They had all been released from the magic spell, and with them came their wives and children. Indeed, the eagle's bride had hatched the egg and carried a beautiful baby girl in her arms. Now all of them traveled to the old king and queen. The miracle child brought his 3 sisters home. Soon he married the beautiful maiden, and their wedding provided great joy and pleasure to everyone. Now the cats run home. My tale is done. The Faithful Animals. Once upon a time there was a man who didn't have much money, and he went out into the wide world with the little money that he had left. He arrived at a village where some young boys had gathered together and were making noise and yelling. "What's going on?" the man asked.
"Oh, we've got a mouse," they answered, "and we're making it dance for us. Just look at the funny way the mouse toddles."
But the man felt sorry for the poor little animal, and he said, "Let the mouse go, boys, and I'll give you some money if you do." So he gave them money, and they let the mouse go. The poor animal ran into a hole as fast as it could. The man went off and came to another village. There, some boys had a monkey who was being forced to dance and do somersaults. The boys were laughing at the monkey and wouldn't leave it in peace. Once again, the man gave them money to let the monkey go. Afterward, the man came to a 3rd village where some boys had a bear on a chain. The bear had to stand on its hind legs and dance, and when it growled, the boys laughed even more. The man bought the bear's freedom as well, and the bear was happy to run on his 4 feet again and dashed off. Now the man had given away the last of his money and didn't have a red cent left in his pocket, so he said to himself, "The king has a great deal of money in his treasure chamber, and he doesn't need it all. You can't let yourself die of hunger. You might as well go and take some, and if you make money later, you can replace what you take." Well, he managed to get into the treasure chamber and take some money. However, as he was creeping out, he was caught by the king's men. They accused him of being a thief and took him to the court. Since he had committed a crime, he was sentenced to be put into a box, and the box was cast off into water. The lid of the box was full of holes so that air could get inside. In addition, he had been given a jug of water and a loaf of bread. As he was floating on the water in a state of fright, he heard some fumbling with the lock and then some gnawing and puffing. All of a sudden, the lock sprang open, the lid popped up, and there stood the mouse, the monkey, and the bear, who had opened the box for him. Since he had helped them, they wanted to repay him. However, they didn't know what step to take next and began discussing the matter with one another. While they were doing this, a white stone that looked like a round egg came rolling into the water.
"It's come at just the right moment,"
said the bear.
"That's the magic stone. Whoever possesses it can wish for whatever he desires."
The man fetched the stone from the water, and when he held it in his hand, he wished for a castle with a garden and stables. No sooner had he uttered the wish than he sat in a castle with a garden and stables. Everything was so beautiful and splendid that he couldn't get over his amazement. After some time passed, several merchants came his way.
"Oh, just look!"
they exclaimed.
"What a glorious castle! The last time we came by here, there was nothing but mere sand."
Since they were curious, they went inside and asked the man how he had managed to build everything so swiftly. "It wasn't I who did it," he said. "It was my magic stone."
"What kind of stone is it?" they asked.
The man went to fetch it and showed it to the merchants. They wanted very much to buy it and asked him to sell it in exchange for all their beautiful wares. The man took a fancy to the wares, and since the heart can be fickle and yearn for new things, he let himself be fooled and thought that the beautiful wares were more valuable than his magic stone. So he gave it away, and no sooner did it leave his hands than his good fortune disappeared, and he sat once more in the locked box on the river, with nothing but a jug of water and a loaf of bread. When the faithful animals, the mouse, the monkey, and the bear, saw his misfortune, they came again and wanted to help him, but this time they couldn't get the lock open because it was much stronger than the first one.
"We've got to get the magic stone back," said the bear, "or else everything we try will be useless."
Since the merchants were still living in the castle, the animals went there together. As they were approaching it, the bear said,
"Mouse, go through the keyhole and tell us what to do. You're small, and nobody will even notice you."
The mouse agreed but came back and said,
"There's nothing we can do. I looked inside, but the stone is hanging on a red ribbon under the mirror, and all around it are cats with fiery eyes. They're stationed there to guard it."
Then the bear and monkey said, "Go back inside and wait until their master is lying asleep in his bed. Then slip through the hole, crawl on top of his bed, pinch his nose, and bite off some of his hair." The mouse crawled back inside and did what the others told him to do. The master woke up and rubbed his nose in great annoyance.
"These cats are useless," he said. "The mice go right by them and bite the hair off of my head."
So he chased the cats away, and the mouse won the day. When the master went to sleep the following night, the mouse crept inside, and she nibbled and gnawed on the red ribbon on which the stone was hanging until the ribbon split in two, and the stone fell to the ground. Then the mouse dragged it to the house door. However, this was hard work for the mouse, and she said to the monkey, who was keeping a lookout,
"Pull it with your paw."
This was easy for the monkey, and after he took the stone in his hand, they all returned to the river.
"How are we going to get to the box?"
the monkey asked.
"We'll deal with that soon enough," said the bear. "I'll get into the water and swim. Monkey, you get on my back. Hold on to me tightly and put the stone in your mouth. Mouse, you can sit in my right ear."
So they did what he said, and he swam down the river. After they had gone some distance, the bear felt that it was too quiet and wanted to talk.
"Listen, monkey," he said. "I think we're good comrades. What do you think?"
However, the monkey kept quiet and didn't reply.
"Is that the way to behave?" said the bear. "Won't you give your comrade an answer? You're a lousy fellow if you don't."
Now the monkey could no longer keep silent. He let the stone fall into the water and cried out,
"You stupid fellow! How could I even answer you when I had the stone in my mouth? Now it's lost and you're to blame."
"Let's not quarrel," said the bear. "We'll think of something."
They discussed the situation and then called together the frogs, the toads, and all the animals that lived in the water and said, "A powerful enemy intends to attack you. Go and collect all the stones you can find, and we'll build a wall to protect you." The animals were frightened and brought stones from all over the place. Finally, a fat, old croaker of a frog emerged from the bottom, carrying a magic stone with a red ribbon in his mouth. Now the bear was happy. He relieved the frog of his burden, told the animals that everything was all right, and sent them home with a quick farewell. Then the three swam down the river to the man in the box, opened the lid with the help of the stone, and arrived just at the right moment, for the man had consumed the bread and he had drunk the water, and he was already half dead. As soon as he held the magic stone in his hands once again, he wished to regain his good health and to be transported to his beautiful castle with the garden and the stables. Then he lived there in happiness, and the three animals stayed with him and had a good life for the rest of their years. The Lazy One and the Industrious One. Once upon a time, there were two journeymen who traveled together, and they swore they would always stick together. However, when they reached a large city, one of them began living loosely and forgot his promise. He left the other, went off by himself, and wandered here and there. Most of all, he loved to be at the places where he could find the most excitement. The other journeyman remained committed to his job in the city, worked industriously, and then continued his travels. One night he passed by the gallows without realizing it, but he saw a man lying asleep on the ground. He was shabby and destitute, and since the stars were so bright, the journeyman recognized him as his former companion. So he laid himself down next to him, covered him with his coat, and fell asleep. However, he was soon awakened by two voices. They were the voices of ravens sitting on top of the gallows. One said,
God provides,
and the other said,
and act according to the situation.
After those words were spoken, one of the ravens fell exhausted to the ground. The other went and sat next to him until it was day. Then he fetched some worms and water, revived him with that, and woke him from the dead. When the two journeymen saw all of this, they were astounded and asked the one raven why the other was so miserable and sick. Then the sick raven said,
It was because I didn't want to do anything, for I believed that all my food would be provided for by heaven.
The two journeymen took the ravens with them to the next village. One of the birds was cheerful and searched for his food. He bathed himself every morning and cleansed himself with his beak. However, the other stayed around the house, was bad-tempered, and always looked shaggy. After a while, the landlord's daughter, who was a beautiful maiden, became very fond of the industrious raven. She picked him up from the floor and petted him with her hand, and then one day she pressed him to her face and gave him a kiss out of sheer delight. The bird fell to the ground, rolled over, fluttered, and turned into a handsome man. Then he revealed that the other raven was his brother, and that they had both insulted their father, who had put a curse on them by saying, "Fly around as ravens until a beautiful maiden kisses you of her own free will." So one of the brothers was released from the spell, but nobody wanted to kiss the one who was idle, and he died as a raven. The journeyman who had been living loosely took a lesson from this, and he became industrious and proper, and took good care of his companion. The Lion and the Frog. There once lived a king and queen, and they had a son and daughter who loved each other dearly. The prince went hunting very often and sometimes remained in the forest for a long time. However, one day he simply didn't return. His sister almost wept herself blind because of this. Finally, when she could no longer stand it, she went into the forest to search for her brother. After she had gone a long way, she was too tired to go any farther, and when she looked around her, a lion was standing nearby. He seemed friendly and very kind, so she sat down on his back, and the lion carried her away. As they went, he kept stroking her with his tail and cooling her cheeks. After they had traveled a good distance, they came to a cave, and the lion carried her inside. She didn't get frightened, nor did she want to jump off the lion's back, because he was so friendly. They went deeper into the cave, where it became darker and darker, until it was eventually pitch black. Nevertheless, they proceeded for a while until they reached daylight again, and they were in a beautiful garden. Everything was fresh and glistened in the sun, and in the middle of the garden was a magnificent palace. When they came to the gate of the palace, the lion stopped, and the princess climbed down from his back. Then the lion began to speak and said, "You shall live in the beautiful house and serve me, and if you carry out all my orders, You shall see your brother again." So the princess served the lion and obeyed all of his commands. One day she went for a walk in the garden where it was very beautiful, but she was still sad because she was alone and forsaken by the world. As she walked here and there, she became aware of a pond, and in the middle of the pond was a small island with a tent on it. Underneath the tent, she saw a frog, who was as green as grass and had a rose leaf on his head instead of a crown. The frog looked at her and said, "Why are you so sad?"
"Ah,"
she replied.
"Why shouldn't I be sad?"
And she told him all about her troubles. Then the frog said to her in a very friendly way,
"If you need anything, just come to me, and I'll lend you a helping hand." "But how shall I pay you back?" "You don't have to pay me back,"
said the frog.
"Just bring me a fresh rose leaf every day for my crown."
The princess returned to the palace and was somewhat comforted. Whenever the lion demanded something, she ran to the pond, and the frog hopped here and there and soon brought her what she needed. After a while, the lion said, "This evening I'd like to eat a gnat pie, but it must be prepared very well." The princess wondered how she could ever get something like that. It seemed impossible for her. She ran out and told her woes to the frog, but the frog said, "Don't worry, I'll make sure that you have a gnat pie." He sat down, opened his mouth to the left and right, and when he snapped it shut, he had caught as many gnats as he needed. Then he hopped here and there, gathered together some wood shavings, and built a fire. When the fire had begun burning, he kneaded the dough for the pie and put it over the coals. After roughly 2 hours, the pie was finished, and one could not have wished for anything better. Then he said to the maiden, "I won't give you the pie until you promise me that when the lion is asleep, you'll cut off his head with the sword that is hidden behind his bed." "No," she said.
I won't do it. The lion's always been good to me." "If you don't do it, you'll never see your brother again," said the frog. "Besides, you won't be harming the lion." So she summoned her courage, took the pie, and brought it to the lion.
"That looks delicious," the lion said, and after sniffing it, he began to eat it right away and ate it all up. When he was finished, he felt tired and wanted to sleep a little, so he said to the princess, "Come and sit down beside me and scratch behind my ears a bit until I fall asleep." She sat down beside him, scratched him with her left hand, and with her right hand she reached for the sword that was lying behind the bed. After the lion had fallen asleep, she drew out the sword, closed her eyes, and chopped off the lion's head with one blow. But when she looked again, the lion had disappeared, and her dear brother stood next to her. He kissed her affectionately and said, "You've released me from the spell, for I was a lion, and I had been cursed to remain so until a maiden's hand would chop off my head out of love for me as a lion." They went together into the garden to thank the frog, but when they got there, they saw that he was hopping all around and gathering together wood shavings to build a fire. When the fire was burning brightly, he hopped into it himself, and it burned a little more until it finally went out, and a beautiful maiden was standing there. This was the prince's sweetheart, who had also been cast under a magic spell. Now they all returned home to the old king and queen, and a great wedding was held. Whoever attended did not go home with an empty stomach. The Soldier and the Carpenter. 2 carpenters lived in a city which their houses touched one another. Each carpenter had a son, and their children were always together and played with one another. That's why they were called Little Knife and Little Fork, which likewise are always placed side by side on the table. When they grew up, they refused to be separated. Since one was courageous and the other timid, one became a soldier and the other learned carpentry. As the time came for the carpenter to go on his travels as a journeyman, the soldier didn't want to be left behind, and so they set out together. When they reached a city, the carpenter went to work for a master craftsman, and since the soldier wanted to remain there too, he hired himself out as a servant in the same house. Everything would have gone well, but the soldier had no desire to work. He just loafed about, and it didn't take long for the master to send him packing. Out of loyalty to his companion, the carpenter decided not to stay. He handed his resignation to the master and departed with the soldier. And that's how things continued to go. If they had work, it didn't last long because the soldier was lazy and he would be sent away, and the carpenter didn't want to stay without him. One day, they arrived in a large city, but when the soldier refused to lift a finger, he was dismissed that very evening, and they had to leave that night. Now their way took them to the edge of a large mysterious forest, and the timid carpenter said,
I'm not going to enter. I'm sure there's witches and ghosts jumping all over the place.
But the soldier replied, Oh, nonsense. I'm not yet afraid of things like that. The soldier went ahead, and since the timid carpenter didn't want to be separated from him, he went along as well. In a short time they lost their way, and they wandered in darkness through the trees. Finally, they saw a light and headed in that direction until they came to a beautiful castle that was brightly lit. In front of the castle was a black dog, and nearby was a red swan on the pond. When they entered the castle, however, they didn't encounter a living creature until they went into the kitchen, where they found a gray cat standing by a pot on the fire and cooking. They moved on and they found many splendid rooms that were all empty, but in one of them there was a table amply covered with food and drink. Since they were both very hungry, they went over to the table and enjoyed a fine meal. Afterwards, the soldier said, Now that we're finished and full, we're entitled to some sleep. What do you say? When he opened a room, he found 2 beautiful beds, so they lay down in them. But just as they were about to fall asleep, it occurred to the timid carpenter that they had not said their prayers yet. As he got up, he saw a cupboard on the wall. He opened it, and inside there was a crucifix with 2 prayer books. He immediately woke the soldier and got him up. Then they knelt down and said their prayers, and fell asleep once more in peace. The next morning the soldier felt such a violent blow that he jumped up into the air. Hey, why are you hitting me? He yelled at his companion, who had also received a blow, and replied,
Well, I didn't hit you. Why did you hit me?
Then the soldier said, It's probably a signal that we should get up. When they left the room, breakfast was already on the table, but the timid carpenter said,
Before we touch it, let's first look for some people.
All right, said the soldier. I agree. Anyway, since the cat prepared and cooked the meal, I've honestly lost my desire to eat it. So they went from the bottom of the castle to the top, but couldn't find a soul. Finally, the soldier said, Hey, let's go search down in the cellar, too. When they went down the stairs, they saw an old woman sitting in front of the first cellar. They began speaking to her and bid her a good day, and they asked if she had cooked the meal for them. The old woman replied,
Yes, children. Did it taste all right?
Then they went further and came to a second cellar, where a young boy of 14 was sitting. They greeted him too, but he didn't answer them. Finally, they moved on to the third cellar, where a maiden of 12 was sitting, and she too didn't answer their greeting. Then they continued walking through all the cellars, but didn't find anyone else. When they returned, the maiden had already stood up from her seat, and they asked her if she would like to go upstairs with them. Then the maiden asked,
"Is the red swan still on the pond up there?"
They told her that they had seen a red swan when they entered the castle. She replied,
"Oh, that's sad. I can't go up with you then."
The young boy was also standing when they came to him, and they repeated the inquiry to him, asking if he would like to go upstairs with them. But he replied,
"Is the black dog still in the courtyard?"
They told the boy that they had seen a black dog when they entered the castle.
"Oh, that's sad then. Well, I can't go upstairs with you."
When they came to the old woman, she had also stood up. "Grandmother," the soldier said, "do you want to come upstairs with us?"
"Is the gray cat still upstairs in the kitchen?"
Quite possibly. The last time we saw the cat, she was sitting at the hearth by a pot and cooking." The old woman replied,
"Oh, that's sad. Unless you killed the red swan, the black dog, and the gray cat, we cannot leave this cellar."
When the two companions went upstairs and into the kitchen again, they wanted to pet the cat, but her fiery eyes began to flash, and she looked very wild. Now, there was still a small room left that they hadn't explored, and when they opened it, they discovered that it was completely empty, except for a bow and arrow, a sword, and iron tongs which were hanging on the wall. Written over the bow and arrow were the words, "This will kill the red swan." Written over the sword were the words, "This will chop off the black dog's head." And over the tongs were the words, "This will pinch off the gray cat's head."
"Ah,"
said the timid carpenter.
"let's get out of here."
But the soldier replied, "No, let's go after those animals." So they took the weapons off the wall and went into the kitchen, where the three animals, the swan, the dog, and the cat, were standing together as if they had something evil in mind. When the timid carpenter saw them, he ran away. The soldier followed and tried to give his companion courage, but the carpenter wanted something to eat first. After he had eaten, he said,
"I saw some suits of armor in a room, and I want to put one on first."
When he was in the room, he looked for a way to escape and said,
"You know, we'd be better off if we climbed through that window. Those animals are not our concern. None of this is."
However, when he went over to the window, he found strong iron bars in front of it. Now he no longer had a way out and went over to the suits of armor. He tried to put one on, but they were all too heavy. Then the soldier said, "Stop this. Let's go the way we are."
"All right,"
said the other,
"but I wish there were 3 of us."
Just as he uttered those words, a white dove began flapping its wings on the outside of a window and bumping up against it. The soldier opened the window, and as soon as the dove hopped inside, a handsome young man stood before them and said, "I'll lend you support and help you." The young man picked up the bow and arrow, but the timid carpenter told him that he was taking the best part of the bargain with the bow and arrow, because he'd be in a good position after he took a shot to run wherever he wanted to, whereas the carpenter and the soldier would have to get physically closer to the enchanted animals to use their weapons. Upon hearing this, the young man exchanged the bow and arrow for the sword. Now all 3 went into the kitchen, where the animals were still together. The young man cut off the dog's head, the soldier grabbed the gray cat with the tongs, and the timid carpenter stood behind and shot the red swan dead. After the 3 animals had been killed, the old woman and her 2 children came running from the cellar all at once and let out a great cry.
"You've killed our dearest friends! You're traitors!"
They charged at the men and wanted to murder them, but the 3 men overpowered them and killed them with their weapons. Once they were dead, the men suddenly began to hear all around them strange murmuring sounds that came out of all the corners. Then the timid carpenter said,
"Let's bury the 3 bodies. After all, they were Christians. We know this from the crucifix."
So they carried the bodies out into the courtyard, dug 3 graves, and laid them down inside. While they were working, however, the murmuring in the castle increased. It became louder and louder, and when they were finished with their work, they heard real voices among the murmurs, and one called out, "Who are you? Who are you?" Since the handsome young man had disappeared, they became afraid and ran away. After they had gone off a little way, the soldier stopped and said, "Hey, we shouldn't have run away. Let's go back and see what's there." "No," the other said. "I want nothing to do with those bewitched creatures. I want to go to the city and earn an honest living." But the soldier gave him no peace until the carpenter agreed to go back with him. When they got to the front of the castle, everything was full of life. Horses dashed through the courtyard, and servants ran back and forth. They pretended to be two poor journeymen and asked for a little something to eat. One of the people said, "Yeah, just come inside. Everyone will be helped today." They were led into a beautiful room and were given food and wine. Afterward, they were asked whether they had seen two young men coming from the castle. They replied that they had not. But when someone saw that they had blood on their hands, he asked where the blood came from. I simply cut my finger," replied the soldier. However, a servant went and told his master, who came himself to see who the men were. Indeed, it was a handsome young man who had come to their aid, and when he laid eyes on them, he cried out, "Those are the two who saved the castle!" He welcomed them with great joy and told them how everything had happened. "A housekeeper was living in the castle with her two children. However, she was really a witch, and one time, when her master scolded her, she replied by doing some evil and transformed all living things in the castle into stone. There were 3 other servants who also knew something about magic, and she had no real power over them and could only turn them into animals. They did their mischief upstairs in the castle, and since she was afraid of them, she fled into the cellar with her children. She had only limited power over me as well, so she changed me into a white dove, but only as long as I was outside of the castle. Inside, I could be myself. When you two came into the castle, you were supposed to kill the animals so she would be set free, and as a reward for that, she would have killed you. But God had things turn out better. The castle is no longer enchanted, and the very moment that the wicked witch and her children were killed, the people who had been turned into stone became alive again, and the murmuring sounds you heard were the words of those people first speaking upon being freed." The young man then led the 2 companions to the lord of the castle, who gave them his 2 beautiful daughters, and they lived happily ever after, as great knights, until the end of their days. The Wild Man. Once upon a time there was a wild man who was under a spell, and he went into the garden and wheat fields of the peasants and destroyed everything. The peasants complained to their lord and told him that they could no longer pay their rent. So the lord summoned all the huntsmen and announced that whoever caught the wild beast would receive a great reward. Then an old huntsman arrived and said he would catch the beast. He took a bottle of brandy, a bottle of wine, and a bottle of beer and set the bottles on the bank of a river where the beast went every day. After doing that, the huntsman hid behind a tree. Soon the beast came and drank up all the bottles. He licked his mouth and looked around to make sure that everything was all right. Since he was drunk, he lay down and fell asleep. The huntsman went over to him and tied his hands and feet. Then he woke the wild man and said, "You wild man, come with me, and you'll get such things to drink every day." The huntsman took the wild man to the royal castle, and they put him into a cage. The lord then visited the other noblemen and invited them to see what kind of beast he had caught. Meanwhile, one of his sons was playing with a ball, and he let it fall into the cage.
Wild man,
said the child.
throw the ball back out to me.
You gotta fetch that ball yourself, said the wild man.
All right, said the child, but I don't have the key.
Then see to it that you fetch it from your mother's pocket. The boy stole the key, opened the cage, and the wild man ran out.
Oh, wild man,
the boy began to scream.
You've got to stay here, or else I'll get a beating.
The wild man picked up the boy and carried him on his back into the wilderness. So the wild man disappeared, and the child was lost. The wild man dressed the boy in a coarse jacket and sent him to the gardener at the emperor's court, where he was to ask whether they could use a gardener's helper. The gardener said yes, but the boy was so grimy and crusty that the others wouldn't sleep near him. The boy replied that he would sleep in the straw. Early each morning he went into the garden, and the wild man came to him and said, "Now wash yourself, now comb your hair." And the wild man made the garden so beautiful that even the gardener himself couldn't do any better. The princess saw the handsome boy every morning, and she told the gardener to have his little assistant bring her a bunch of flowers. When the boy came, she asked him about his home and family, and he replied that he didn't know them. Then she gave him a roast chicken full of gold coins. When he got back to the gardener, he gave him the money and said,
"What should I do with it? You can use it."
Later, he was ordered to bring the princess another bunch of flowers, and she gave him a duck full of gold coins, which he also gave to the gardener. On a third occasion, she gave him a goose full of ducats, which the young man again passed on to the gardener. The princess thought that he had money, and yet he had nothing. They got married in secret, and her parents became angry and made her work in a brewery, and she also had to support herself by spinning. The young man would go into the kitchen and help the cook prepare the roast, and sometimes he stole a piece of meat and brought it to his wife. Soon there was a mighty war in England, and the emperor and all the great armies had to travel there. The young man said he wanted to go there too, and asked whether they had a horse in the stables for him. They told him that they had one that ran on 3 legs that would be good enough for him. So he mounted that horse, and the horse went off, clippity-clop. Then the wild man approached him, and he had opened a large mountain in which there was a regiment of 1,000 soldiers and officers. The young man put on some fine clothes and was given a magnificent horse. Then he set out for the war in England with all of his men. The emperor welcomed him in a friendly way and asked him to lend his support. The young man defeated everyone and won the battle, whereupon the emperor extended his thanks to him and asked him where his army came from.
"Don't ask me that," he replied. "I can't tell you."
Then he rode off with his army and left England. The wild man approached him again and took all the men back into the mountain. The young man had mounted his 3-legged horse and went back home.
"Here comes our hobblety-hop again with his 3-legged horse," the people cried out.
And then they asked,
"Were you lying behind the hedge and sleeping?"
"Well," he said, "if I hadn't been in England, things wouldn't have gone so well for the emperor." They said,
"Boy, be quiet, or else the gardener will really let you have it."
The second time, everything had happened as it had before, and the third time, the young man won the whole battle, but he was wounded in the arm. The emperor took his kerchief, wrapped the wound, and tried to make the boy stay with him.
"No, I'm not going to stay with you. It's of no concern to you who I am."
Once again, the wild man approached the young man and took all of his men back into the mountain. The young man mounted his 3-legged horse once more and went back home. The people began laughing and said,
"Here comes our hobblety-hop again. Were you lying again asleep this time?" "Truthfully, I wasn't sleeping," he said. "England is totally defeated, and there's finally peace."
Now, the emperor talked about the handsome knight who provided support, and the young man said to the emperor,
"If I hadn't been with you, it wouldn't have turned out so well."
The emperor wanted to give him a beating, but the young man said,
"Stop! If you don't believe me,
Let me show you my arm." When he revealed his arm, and the emperor saw the wound wrapped in the kerchief, he was amazed and said, "Perhaps you are the Lord himself, or an angel whom God has sent to me." And he asked the boy for his pardon for treating him so cruelly, and then gave him his whole kingdom. Now, the wild man was released from the magic spell, and stood there as a great king and told his entire story. The mountain turned into a royal castle, and the young man went there with his wife, and they lived in the castle happily until the end of their days. The Starving Children. Once upon a time, there was a woman with 2 daughters, and they had become so poor that they no longer had even a piece of bread to put into their mouths. Their hunger became so great that their mother became unhinged and desperate.
"Indeed," she said to her children, "I've got to kill you so I can have something to eat." "Oh, dear mother," said one daughter, "spare me, and I'll go out and see if I can get something without begging."
So the girl went out and came back carrying a little piece of bread, which they shared with one another. But it was not enough to still their hunger. Therefore, the mother spoke to the other daughter.
"Now it's your turn to die."
"Oh, dear mother," she answered,
"Spare me, and I'll go and get something to eat from somewhere else without anyone noticing me."
This daughter too went away and came back carrying 2 little pieces of bread. They shared it with one another, but it was not enough to still their hunger. Therefore, when a few hours had gone by, their mother said to them once more,
"You've got to die, or else we'll all waste away."
They spoke calmly to their mother and told her that they would all lie down and sleep, and they wouldn't get up again until Judgment Day arrived. So they did just that. They lay down and they fell into a deep sleep, and no one could wake them from it. Meanwhile, during this rest, their mother had departed, and no one knows where she went. The Holy Woman Kummernis. Once upon a time there was a pious maiden who swore to God she wouldn't marry. Since she was so remarkably beautiful, her father wouldn't accept this and tried to force her to marry. Confronted with this predicament, the maiden implored God to let her grow a beard, and this happened right away. The king was so enraged that he had her crucified, and she became a saint. Now it so happened that a very poor minstrel went into the church where her statue was kept. He knelt down in front of it, and the saint was glad that the minstrel was the first one to recognize her innocence. Consequently, the statue, which was adorned with golden slippers, let one slipper drop to the ground so the pilgrim could have it. He bowed in gratitude and took the gift. Soon the people in the church became aware that the golden slipper was missing, and questions were asked all around until finally the slipper was found on the poor fiddler. He was now condemned as a wicked thief and led to the gallows to be hanged. The procession went by the church where the statue was standing, and the fiddler requested permission to go inside, pour out his heart to his benefactress with his fiddle, and say his last farewell. His request was granted, but no sooner had he moved his bow than behold, the statue let the other golden slipper drop to the ground, and thus demonstrated that he had not committed the theft. So the irons and rope were taken off of the fiddler, who went merrily on his way. From then on, the holy saint was called Solicitous. The Robber Bridegroom. There was once a miller who had a beautiful daughter, and when she was grown up, he became anxious that she should be well married and taken care of. So he thought, "If a decent sort of man comes and asks her in marriage, I'll give her to him." Soon after, a suitor came forward who seemed very well-to-do, and as the miller knew nothing to his disadvantage, he promised him his daughter. But the girl did not seem to love him as a bride should love her bridegroom. She had no confidence in him. As often as she saw him or thought about him, she felt a chill at her heart. One day he said to her, "You are to be my bride, and yet you have never been to see me." The girl answered,
"I do not know where your house is."
and then he said, "My house is a long way in the wood." She began to make excuses, and said that she could not find the way to it, but the bridegroom said, "You must come and pay me a visit next Sunday. I have already invited company, and I will strew ashes on the path through the wood, so that you will be sure to find it." When Sunday came, and the girl set out on her way, she felt very uneasy without knowing exactly why, and she filled both pockets full of peas and lentils. There were ashes strewed on the path through the wood, but, nevertheless, at each step she cast to the right and to the left a few peas on the ground. So she went on the whole day until she came to the middle of the wood, where it was the darkest, and there stood a lonely house, not pleasant in her eyes, for it was dismal and unhomelike. She walked in, but there was no one there, and the great stillness reigned. Suddenly she heard a voice cry,
Turn back, thou pretty bride. Within this house thou must not bide, for here do evil things betide."
Then the pretty bride went from one room into another throughout the whole house, but it was quite empty, and no soul was to be found in it. At last she reached the cellar, and there sat a very old woman nodding her head.
"Can you tell me,"
said the bride,
"if my bridegroom lives here?" "Oh, poor child," answered the woman, "do you know what has happened to you? You are in a place of cutthroats. You thought you were a bride, and soon to be married, but death will be your spouse. Look here, I have a great kettle of water to set on, and when once they have you in their power, they will cut you in pieces without mercy, cook you in this kettle, and eat you, for they are cannibals. Unless I have pity on you and save you, all is over with you."
Then the old woman hid behind the great cask, where she could not be seen.
"Be as still as a mouse," said she. "Do not move or go away, or else you are lost. At night, when the robbers are asleep, we will escape. I have been waiting a long time for an opportunity."
No sooner was it settled than the wicked gang entered the house. They brought another young woman with them, dragging her along, and they were drunk, and would not listen to her cries and groans. They gave her wine to drink, 3 glasses full, one of white wine, one of red, and one of yellow, and then they cut her into pieces. The bride, all the while, shaking and trembling when she saw what fate the robbers had intended for her. One of them noticed on the little finger of their victim a golden ring, and as he could not draw it off easily, he took an axe and he chopped the finger off, but the finger jumped away and fell behind the cask on the bride's lap. The robber took up a light to look for it, but he could not find it. Then said one of the others, "Have you looked behind the great cask?" But just then the old woman cried,
"Come to supper, and leave off looking till tomorrow. The finger cannot run away."
Then the robbers said the old woman was right, and they left off searching and sat down to eat, and the old woman dropped some sleeping stuff into their wine, so that before long they stretched themselves on the cellar floor, sleeping and snoring. When the bride heard that, she came from behind the cask, and had to make her way among the sleepers lying all about on the ground, and she felt very much afraid lest she might awaken any of them. But by good luck she passed through, and the old woman with her, and they opened the door, and they made all haste to leave that house of murderers. The wind had carried away the ashes from the path, but the peas and lentils had budded and sprung up, and the moonshine upon them showed the way. And they went on through the night until the morning, and they reached the mill. Then the girl related to her father all that had happened to her. When the wedding day came, the friends and neighbors assembled, the miller having invited them, and the bridegroom also appeared. When they were all seated at the table, each one had to tell a story, but the bride sat still and said nothing, until at last the bridegroom said to her,
"Now, sweetheart, do you know no story? Tell us something."
She answered,
"I will tell you my dream. I was going alone through a wood, and I came at last to a house in which there was no living soul, but by the wall was a birdcage who cried, 'Turn back, thou pretty bride! Within this house thou must not bide, for evil things do here betide.' And then again it said it. Sweetheart, the dream is not ended. Then I went through all the rooms, and they were all empty, and it was so lonely and wretched. At last I went down into the cellar, and there sat an old woman nodding her head. I asked her if my bridegroom lived in that house, and she answered, 'Oh, poor child, you have come into a place of cutthroats. Your bridegroom does live here, but he will kill you and cut you in pieces, and then cook you and eat you.' Sweetheart, the dream is not ended." But the old woman hid me behind a great cask, and no sooner had she done so than the robbers came home, dragging with them a young woman, and they gave her to drink wine thrice, white, red, and yellow. Sweetheart, the dream is not yet ended. And then they killed her, cut her into pieces. Sweetheart, the dream has not yet ended. And one of the robbers saw a gold ring on the finger of the young woman, and as it was difficult to get off, he took an axe and chopped off the finger, which jumped upwards and then fell behind the great cask right onto my lap. And here is the finger with the ring."
At these words she drew it forth and showed it to the company. The robber, who during the story had grown deadly white, sprang up, and he would have escaped, but the folks held him fast and delivered him to justice, and he and his whole gang were for their evil deeds condemned and executed. Johannes Waterspring and Caspar Waterspring. A king insisted his daughter was not to marry, and had a house built for her in the most secluded part of the forest. She had to live there with her ladies-in-waiting, and no other human being was allowed to see her. Near the house in the woods, however, there was a spring with marvelous qualities, and when the princess drank from it, she consequently gave birth to 2 princes. They were identical twins and named after the spring, Johannes Waterspring and Caspar Waterspring. Their grandfather, the old king, had them instructed in hunting, and as they grew older, they became big and handsome young men. When the day arrived for them to set out into the world, each received a silver star, a horse, and a dog to take on the journey. Once they came to a forest, they immediately saw 2 hares, and they wanted to shoot them. But the hares asked for mercy, and said that they would like to serve them, and that they could be useful and help them whenever they were in danger. The 2 brothers let themselves be persuaded, and took them along as servants. Soon after, they came upon 2 bears, and when they took aim at them, these animals also cried out for mercy, and promised to serve them faithfully. So the retinue was increased, and now they came to a crossroad where they said, "We've got to separate here, and one of us should go to the right, and the other should head off to the left." Before doing this, each of them stuck a knife in a tree at the crossroad, so that they could determine by the rust whether the other was faring well, and whether he was still alive. Then they took leave from one another, kissed one another, and rode off. Johannes Waterspring came to a city that was quite still and sad, because the princess was to be sacrificed to a dragon that was devastating the entire country, and could be pacified only by this sacrifice. It was announced that whoever wanted to risk his life and kill the dragon would receive the princess for his bride. However, no one had volunteered. They had also tried to trick the monster by sending out the princess's chambermaid, but the dragon realized what was happening right away and did not take the bait. Johannes Waterspring thought, "You must try your luck. Perhaps you'll succeed." And so he set out with his company and headed towards the dragon's nest. The battle was fierce. The dragon spewed forth fire and flames and ignited all the grass around them, so that Johannes Waterspring certainly would have suffocated if the hare, the dog, and the bear had not stamped out and subdued the fire. Finally, the dragon succumbed, and Johannes Waterspring cut off its 7 heads and then sliced its 7 tongues, which he stuck into a sack. Now, however, he was so tired that he laid down right at that spot and fell asleep. While he was sleeping, the prince's coachman arrived, and when he saw the young man lying there, and the 7 heads next to him, he thought, "You've got to take advantage of this." So he stabbed Johannes Waterspring to death, and took the 7 heads with him. He carried everything to the king and said that he had killed the monster. Indeed, he had brought the 7 heads as evidence, and the princess then became his bride. In the meantime, Johannes Waterspring's animals had set up camp nearby after the battle and had also slept. When they returned to their master, they found him dead. As they were looking, they saw how the ants whose mound had been stamped on during the battle were spreading the sap from an oak tree on their dead ones, and these ants immediately came back to life. So the bear went and fetched some of the sap, and he spread it on Johannes Waterspring. Shortly thereafter, Johannes was completely well and healthy, and he thought about the princess for whom he had fought. So he rushed to the city, where her marriage to the coachman was being celebrated, and the people were saying that the coachman had killed the 7-headed dragon. Johannes Waterspring's dog and bear ran into the castle where the princess tied some roast meat and wine around their necks, and ordered her servants to follow the animals and to invite their owner to the wedding. So now, Johannes Waterspring showed up at the wedding just as the platter with the 7 dragon heads was being displayed. These were the heads that the coachman had brought with him, but now Johannes Waterspring pulled out the 7 tongues from his sack and placed them next to the heads. Consequently, he was declared the real dragon slayer and became the princess's husband, while the coachman was banished. Not long thereafter, Johannes went out hunting and followed a deer with silver antlers. He hunted the deer for a long time, but could not catch it. Finally, he met an old woman, who turned him and his dog, horse and bear, into stone. Meanwhile, Caspar Waterspring returned to the tree in which he and his brother had stuck their knives, and saw that his brother's knife had rusted. He immediately decided to search for his twin and rode off. Soon he came to the city where his brother's wife was living. She thought he was her real husband because he looked just like him, and was delighted by his return, and insisted that he stay with her. But Caspar Waterspring continued traveling until he found his brother and the animals all turned into stone. Soon after, he forced the old woman to break the magic spell, and then the 2 brothers rode towards their home. Along the way, they agreed that the first one to be embraced by the princess should be her husband. Well, it turned out that she embraced Johannes Waterspring. The Bird Phoenix. One day a rich man went for a walk along the river. All at once he saw a small casket swimming by. He grabbed hold of the casket, and when he opened the cover, he saw a small child lying inside of it. So he took the child home and had him raised in his house. However, the rich man disliked the boy, and one time he took the boy with him in a boat on the river. Once the boat was in the middle of the river, he swam to shore and left the child alone in the boat. The boat continued floating down the river until it passed the mill, and the miller saw the child. The miller took pity on the child, fetched him from the boat, and raised him in his house. One day the rich man happened to come by, recognized the child, and carried him away. Soon thereafter, he gave the young man a letter to bring to his wife, and the letter read, "As soon as you read this letter, you are to kill the person who delivered it." However, as the young man was traveling through the forest, he met an old man who said to him,
"Show me the letter that you're carrying in your hand."
The old man took the letter, turned it around once, and gave it back to the young man. Now the letter read, "You are immediately to offer our daughter as wife to the young man delivering this letter." And this is what happened. And when the rich man heard about this, he became furious and said,
"Well, this wedding's not going to happen so quickly. Before I give you my daughter, you must bring me 3 feathers from the bird Phoenix."
So the young man set out on his way to the bird Phoenix and met the old man again on the same spot in the forest.
"Keep walking for the entire day," he said. "In the evening you will come to a tree. 2 doves will be sitting on it, and they'll tell you how to proceed."
That evening, when the young man came to the tree, 2 doves were sitting on it. One of the doves said,
Whoever searches for the bird Phoenix must walk the entire day. In the evening, he'll come to a gate that's locked."
Then the second dove said,
"There's a golden key that lies underneath this tree, and it will open the gate."
The young man found the key and later used it to open the gate. 2 men were sitting there at that time, and one of them said,
"Whoever searches for the bird Phoenix must travel a great distance over a high mountain, and then he'll finally come to the castle."
On the evening of the 3rd day, he finally reached the castle, where a wise little lady sat and said,
"What do you want here?"
"Oh, I'd like to get 3 feathers from the bird Phoenix."
"Your life is in danger," she said. "If the bird Phoenix becomes aware of your presence, he'll eat you up, skin and hair. Nevertheless, I'll see if I can help you get the 3 feathers. He comes here every day, and I must comb him with a narrow comb. So now quick, get underneath that table there."
After he did this, the young man was then covered completely by a cloth. Meanwhile, the bird Phoenix came home, sat down at the table, and said,
I smell human flesh." "Oh, what? You see, don't you? There's no one here other than you and I." "Comb me now,"
the bird Phoenix responded. The wise little lady combed the bird Phoenix, and as she was doing this, he fell asleep. When he was sound asleep, she grabbed a feather, pulled it out, and threw it beneath the table. All at once, the bird Phoenix woke up.
"Why are you tearing my hair like that? I dreamt that a human came and pulled one out of my feathers."
She calmed him down, and so it went, 2 more times. When the young man had the 3 feathers, he set out for home, and was now able to obtain his bride. The Old Grandfather and the Grandson. Once upon a time, there was an old man who could barely walk. His knees trembled, and he didn't hear or see much. Moreover, he had lost all of his teeth. When he sat at the dinner table, he could barely hold the spoon. He spilled the soup on his napkin, and the food continued to flow from his mouth. His son and his son's wife felt disgusted by this, and therefore the grandfather finally had to take a place behind the oven in the corner of the room. They gave him his food in a clay bowl. In addition, it was never full, and he would look morosely over to the table, his eyes filled with tears. One time his trembling hand could not grasp the bowl tightly enough, and it fell to the ground and broke. The young wife scolded him, While he said nothing and only sighed. So they bought a wooden bowl for a penny, and he now had to eat out of that. One time as they were sitting at the dinner table, the little 4-year-old grandson collected small wooden sticks on the floor. "What are you doing there?" his father asked.
"Oh,"
the child answered,
"I'm making a little trough so Mother and Father can eat out of it when I'm older and bigger."
Then the husband and wife looked at each other for a while. Finally, they burst into tears and immediately brought the old grandfather to the table. From then on, they let him eat with them, and they also said nothing whenever he happened to spill a few things. The 3 Ravens. Once upon a time, there was a mother who had 3 little sons who were playing cards one day next to the church. And when the sermon was finally finished, their mother returned home and saw what they had been doing. So she cursed her godless children, and they were immediately turned into 3 coal-black ravens and flew away. The 3 brothers, however, had a little sister who loved them with all of her heart, and she grieved so much about their banishment that she no longer had any peace of mind, and finally set out to look for them. The only thing that she took with her for the long, long journey was a little stool on which she rested when she became too tired, and she ate nothing the entire time but wild apples and pears. Unfortunately, she couldn't find the 3 ravens, but one time, when they had flown over her head, one of them had dropped a ring, and when she picked it up, she recognized it as the ring that she had given to her youngest brother one time as a present. The sister continued her journey, and she went so far, so very far, until she came to the end of the world, and went to the sun, which was, however, much too hot, and ate small children. So after that she went to the moon, which was, however, much too cold, and also mean, and when it saw her, it said,
"I smell human flesh! I smell human flesh!"
So the maiden left there quickly and went to the stars, which were good to her, and each one sat on a little stool, and the morning star stood up and gave her a gammy leg to help her open the gate to the glass mountain.
"If you don't have this little leg, you won't be able to climb the glass mountain. It's on the glass mountain that you'll find your brothers."
So the sister took the gammy leg, wrapped it in some cloth, and continued her journey until she came to the glass mountain. However, the gate was closed, and just as she wanted to take the gammy leg from the cloth, she discovered that she had lost it somewhere along the way. Since she didn't know what to do, she took a knife, sliced off her pinky, stuck it into the lock, and opened the gate. Then a little dwarf came towards her and said,
"My child, what are you looking for here?" "I'm looking for my brothers, the 3 ravens."
"The Lord Ravens are not at home," said the little dwarf.
"If you want to wait, then come in."
And the little dwarf brought 3 little plates and 3 little mugs, and the sister ate a bit from each little plate and drank a sip from each mug, and she let the little ring fall into the last mug. All of a sudden, a whizzing and buzzing could be heard in the air.
"The Lord Ravens are flying back home,"
said the little dwarf, and the ravens began to speak one after the other.
"Who has eaten from my plate? Who has drunk from my little mug?"
And as the 3rd raven, however, came to his little mug, he found the ring and saw clearly that their little sister had arrived. They recognized her because of the ring, and they were all saved and transformed and were happy to go back home. and as it had begun, it is now done. That's it, everyone. We have, to the best of our knowledge, sought out, found, and read every single story written and told by the Brothers Grimm. We want to thank you for being along for this ride. It's been such a long journey. We started this channel in July of 2023, and here it is February of 2024, and we are finally wrapping up with all of the tales. Again, we thank you for being along with us on this ride. We appreciate you all. We've got some really fun things in store for you in the near future. There's a lot of great stories on this channel. Feel free to wander about and give them all a listen. And until the next time, sweet dreams.